The Servitude of Sin. Sermon 2 by John Balguy. John chapter 8 verse 34, quote, Jesus answered them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. End quote. These words are a part of one of our Saviour's conferences with the Jews, wherein he had been informing those who believed on him how they might become, quote, his disciples indeed, end quote, namely by, quote, continuing in his word, end quote, nor barely in the belief or profession of it, but in a steadfast conformity of their minds and manners thereto, the consequence of which we find set forth in the verse immediately following, quote, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free, end quote. The Jews, mistaking his meaning, and being startled at anything that looked like an imputation of servitude, presently answered that they had no occasion for the freedom he offered them. Quote, we be Abraham's seed, end quote, say they, quote, and were never in bondage to any man. How sayest thou then, ye shall be made free, end quote. To undeceive them, therefore, our Saviour gives them to understand that however free they might be in a civil or political sense, though even in that respect they had then no reason to boast, yet in a moral sense they were certainly not so, supposing them as independent of all foreign powers as they pretended or imagined, yet might they not groan under a domestic bondage? Might they not be subject to the dominion and tyranny of sin? To assure them that this was a true subjection, a real bondage, he proceeds in the words of my text, quote, Verily, verily, I say unto you, whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin, end quote. Abstracting from the occasion of these remarkable words, I shall go on to explain and account for the general proposition contained in them. Accordingly, I shall, first, endeavour to show the perpetual and unavoidable connection between sin and servitude, and, secondly, I shall point out some peculiar properties and circumstances in the servitude of sin, tending to deter us from it, and excite our resolutions against it. First, I am to show the perpetual and unavoidable connection between sin and servitude. We find in Scripture that a state of sin is constantly represented as a state of servility and slavery, that sinners are considered as captives and vassals, and sin as a master, a ruler, a tyrant. It is described as, quote, reigning, end quote, in us, as, quote, having dominion over us, end quote, as holding us in, quote, captivity, end quote. The natural, carnal man is said to be, quote, sold under sin, end quote, and his conversion is called, quote, being made free from sin, end quote. Quote, know ye not, end quote, says the apostle, quote, that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death, or of obedience unto righteousness, end quote. Hence it appears that serve and obey we must, either sin or righteousness, but with this material difference, as will be shown afterwards, that one service is intolerable slavery, and the other perfect freedom. The laws of righteousness are so many wise rules essential to our happiness, and directly tending to liberty. The laws of sin, chains and fetters, misery and bondage. Conformably hereto, we are to understand the words of my text, and all other expressions of the like nature, namely, that a state of sin is a state of real servitude, and that of the vilest and most grievous kind. But it may be requisite to give a more distinct account of this matter, and to show briefly how and why sin and servitude are inseparable, that natural liberty, that free will, as it is commonly called, which constitutes man an agent, can never be lost, whatever sins he may commit. If any man be supposed to lose his liberty in this sense, the consequence would be that he could not possibly sin any more, for wanting this necessary power, he could never do either well or ill, or, to speak more properly, he could do nothing at all. And were this the case, instead of saying that sin brings a man into bondage, or makes a slave of him, it should be said that it turns an agent into a patient, and transforms the man into a mere machine. Most evident therefore it is, that this liberty can never be destroyed, not even in the greatest and most inveterate sinners. If then it be asked, what liberty that is, which appears concerned in the case before us, I answer, a moral liberty, if it may be so called. Whatever it be called, the thing itself is most plain and certain. By sinning, such an additional weight is laid upon the will, the inducements and temptations to sin grow so much stronger, that though men can still refrain, still choose, yet they find themselves greatly perplexed and embarrassed in their choice. When they have sinned for some time, they find a difficulty in refraining, afterwards a greater, and at last a moral impossibility. The force of custom is very great quite through the animal creation. All living creatures are much affected by it, and determined, as it were, to a certain course of action. What they have done before, they are most apt and most inclined to do still, insomuch that they are very hardly brought out of a track to which they have been long accustomed. And thus it is even with man, who continually finds and feels the power and prevalence of custom, even in things of a mechanical consideration, wherein the mind is little or nothing concerned. Custom gives a readiness and a facility not to be acquired without it. And though it be much harder to account for it, the case is evidently the same in respect of the operations of the mind. Use and practice always leave an impression proportionable to their continuance. By repeated acts, habits are formed, and every habit becomes, as it were, a natural propension. Hence things, otherwise difficult, are not only rendered easy to be done, but hard to be omitted. The mind finds itself insensibly engaged, and its faculties, in some measure, determined and confined. And as we feel and confess the force of habits in general, so we cannot but be sensible that sinful ones are peculiarly powerful. The corruption of our nature, wheresoever it be derived, is itself a strong bent, a prevailing attachment, and when custom is added to it, the difficulty must needs be doubled. The stream of our natural inclinations is hereby swelled and made more rapid, and by consequence less capable of being either opposed or diverted. The mighty power of sinful habits is elegantly represented in the words of the prophet, quote, "Can the Ethiopian change his skin, or the leopard his spots? Then may ye also do good, that are accustomed to do evil," end quote. Though this ought not to be understood literally and strictly, yet it can mean no less than that vicious habits are exceedingly hard to be cured, that they take deep root in the mind, and are never plucked up without extreme difficulty. Since then the tyranny of custom is acknowledged and complained of by all mankind, since it is generally allowed that by the mere force of habit a man may become a slave to almost anything, how much more reason have we to apprehend and confess the heavier bondage of sin? Where corrupt nature and confirmed custom join their powers, and pull both the same way, how hard must it be to resist them? They are indeed always conquerable, but how seldom conquered? How strong must be that resolution, how vigorous that effort of mind, by which such a victory is gained? When a man moves not only down a steep descent, but in a beaten track, it must be very difficult to retreat, or even to stop. In short, when sin has taken possession of the mind, and worked itself into an inveterate habit, it gains an established mastery, and a kind of absolute dominion. But this is not all, for it operates antecedently to the formation of habit. At the very instant of commission, the sinner enters into servitude, and his captivity commences that moment. His first compliance with a sinful temptation is a violation of his liberty. I am still speaking of that moral liberty above mentioned, which consists in an entire disengagement from everything that his reason disapproves, according to which account the least attachment to an irregular object wounds his freedom, and in some measure entangles him. When a man is tempted into sin, or, in the Apostle's words, quote, "when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed," end quote, by that very act of compliance he yields, submits, and surrenders himself into the power and possession of a new master. He so far resigns his authority, and, as it were, sets his hand to the alienation of his own liberty. Whoever obeys the impulse of a sinful passion, or the instigation of a criminal appetite, must do it in opposition to his reason, judgment, duty, and interest, and this he would never consent to, never endure to think of, while his mind was perfectly free and disengaged. It is the chief glory and prerogative of man's nature that he is possessed of such principles, and enabled to follow their direction. A fixed power and a constant inclination to pursue the dictates of reason without deviation or disturbance is the perfection of a moral agent. In the very nature of the thing, wherever reason resides, it ought to govern, as being essentially supreme, and it is equally evident that those inferior principles, the animal appetites and affections, were made to be governed and kept in subjection. Whenever this order is inverted, the consequence is and must be confusion. For if these lusts and passions rebel and prevail, they directly carry the man away captive, and he finds himself in the hands of usurpers and tyrants. But this will further appear under the second head, wherein I propose to point out some peculiar properties and circumstances in the servitude of sin, tending to deter us from it, and excite our resolutions against it. And first I would observe how dishonourable it is, how mean and unbecoming, how unworthy of a rational creature. To serve sin is to serve the vilest, most deformed, and most detestable thing in the whole world. It is to serve the distemper of our minds, and the corruption of our nature, the root of all evil, and the ruin of a great part of the creation. It is to serve God's professed enemy, and indeed the sole object of his indignation and abhorrence. In fine, it is to serve that rebellious spirit, who was its first parent, its original author, and whose great engine it is in working the destruction of mankind. How then can we bear to submit to a servitude so ignoble, so infamous as this? God has endued us with sublime power and glorious privileges, given us a capacity for wisdom and virtue, and formed us after his own image. Thus dignified, thus exalted, can we so far stoop and debase ourselves as to serve sin? Instead of improving these precious gifts, shall we blot the image of God and bury our honours in the dust? He has made, and placed, us little lower than the angels, But alas, we often find ways and means to unmake ourselves, and shamefully sink down almost to a level with the creatures beneath us. The mind of man is a rational, free, and immortal spirit, vested with great powers and perfections, and designed for greater. How can such a being as this subject itself to mere animal instincts, and become a captive to blind lusts and brutish passions? How mean, how abject is that man's condition who chooses to be thus governed, who groans under a voluntary bondage, and is a slave of his own making. Nothing appears more honourable or more becoming in wisdom's eye than keeping good order within, and maintaining the authority of a man's own mind. He who ruleth his spirit, is pronounced by Solomon, better than he who taketh a city, Many cities have been taken, many provinces and kingdoms ingloriously conquered, by those men who never were their own masters, heroes, forsooth, who, in the midst of their conquests, tamely passed under the yoke to their domineering lusts and tyrannical humours. While they drew the admiration and dazzled the eyes of mankind, they were really in a baser and more servile condition than the meanest of their captives. What availed the number of their victories, or the pomp of their triumphs, while they carried such untamed rioters, such imperious rebels within their own bosom? The quelling of these private mutineers, the quieting these domestic tumults and commotions, would have been more for their honour than defeating the greatest armies and vanquishing all the nations upon earth. In short, to abandon reason and give up the rein to appetite and passion is the meanest and most ignominious state that man can fall into. But secondly, as the servitude of sin is thus dishonourable, so it is no less troublesome and tormenting. Whenever a man engages in a sinful course of life, he may justly be said to take his leave of all true peace and tranquillity of mind. Besides that remorse which is sure to seize him sooner or later, and which will prove at length the very, gall of bitterness, he may expect great disquiet and continual perplexity, However sin may delude him at first, he will soon discover that he has sown vanity and must reap vexation, soon find himself hurried into many anxious pursuits and restless undertakings, tossed about from action to action, from project to project, in obedience to that inclination which happens to be uppermost. Let him lay a serious scheme, or form a beneficial design. Let him enter with full purpose of mind into the pursuit of it. Presently arises some irregular appetite, which crosses his way, and carries him transverse, which, like a wandering vapour, leads him through byways and unfrequented places, till he is quite bewildered, and neither knows how to get backward nor forward. The unhappy sinner has such a variety of lords and masters that his task is never done, his drudgery never at an end, and so rigorous they are as seldom to allow him any respite. It is required of him that he answer every demand, and be ready at every call, however foolish or fantastic. He never knows 1 minute beforehand what his appetites and passions will please to give him leave to do next. Be their orders never so senseless or silly, he is bound and must obey at all events. And what is still worse, he is frequently divided and drawn many different ways at once, perplexed with inconsistent schemes, and distracted between opposite demands. Let ambition and sloth, or avarice and luxury, prevail and fix in the same breast. How must the servant of sin behave in such a case? How compromise matters between such rival lusts, such repugnant appetites? What comfort, what quiet could he find amidst the continual cravings of his purse and his palate? Whoever pretends to serve two such masters shall satisfy neither, but will be sure most effectually to plague himself. Tyranny is generally reputed the natural aversion of mankind. We pretend to detest it in all shapes, and to dread the very appearances of it. What think we then of those domestic tyrants, our sinful lusts, which are not only endured, but cherished by us, though they assume an absolute sway, and rule us with a rod of iron, which deprives us almost of our liberties, and sometimes of our lives, and break through all laws, both divine and human? If we are to be governed by will and humour, appetite and passion, what matters it whether it be at first or at second hand? If, renouncing our reason and liberty, we are willing to wear chains, is it not a point of small moment who puts them on? We might further take notice what trouble is occasioned by that boisterous affection which is peculiarly called passion, what a tumult it produces in a man's whole frame, what commotion in his body, and confusion in his mind, how it perverts his faculties, and, as it were, transports the man out of himself. What enjoyment, what ease can he expect, while such a storm is shaking his constitution, and turning his nature upside down? In short, wherever it gets the mastery, it not only robs a man of his liberty, but renders every comfort of his life precarious, placing him at the mercy of every little accident, and never suffering him to be secure of a minute's repose. But, thirdly, considering the dishonour and vexation to which sin exposes men, it might well be expected, to make them amends, that it should prove very beneficial, and yield them great advantages of some kind or other. But alas, the servitude of sin is likewise unprofitable, and not only unprofitable, but pernicious. Let the sinner examine and state his own case. Let him compute fairly his gains and his losses. What will he find at the foot of the account? On the side of his losses, health, liberty, credit, peace, and satisfaction of mind. In a word, the chief comforts of this life, and all his hopes in the next. On the side of his gains, mere ciphers, that is, a few broken pleasures, or rather shadows of pleasure, which vanished, quote, as a morning cloud, end quote, and, quote, as the early dew, end quote, passed away. The enjoyments of sin are so very superficial, have so little truth or substance in them, give so little content to the mind, that they are not really sufficient recompense for the bondage of one day. But this is not the worst of the case. The service of sin is not only unprofitable, but in the highest degree dangerous and destructive. If a man persevere in it, he is ruined to all intents and purposes, and vicious habits are so very hard to be shaken off that, at least, he runs a desperate hazard. Some services are limited to a certain period of time, and when that arrives, men are at liberty in course. But in the service of sin, the longer they are bound, the faster they are, and the further from being loose. Every sin they commit strengthens the engagement and weakens themselves. When a man has been long in subjection to his lusts and passions, he commonly finds his spirits broken, so far at least that he has seldom vigour and resolution enough to work his deliverance. He has become like a disabled ship, which floats along at the mercy of the winds and waves. A gust of humour or a tide of inclination carries him this way or that, just as it happens. Many and great are even the present inconveniences of a sinful course of life, which continually exposes men to danger and betrays them into hardships of various kinds. It leads them into 1,000 snares and frequently involves them in inextricable difficulties. It puts them upon such attempts and engages them in such measures, the consequence of which is always mischievous and often fatal. The truth is, vice and security are utterly inconsistent, never did, nor never will dwell together. The wicked man has nothing to trust to, has never an anchor left but repentance, and that he turns his back on till it become useless. Wisdom and virtue are steady principles, always to be depended on. A man may easily know what to expect from them, and how they will prove in the result. I mean, not only as to their final issue, but even in relation to his present concerns. Whereas sinful lusts are uncertain, variable, and giddy, as following no rules, and being confined to no bounds. Whoever has thrown himself into their power must be ever in danger, and often in distress. If these grievances reached no further, if death put an end to the sinner's sufferings, he might draw some little comfort from such an expectation. But however hard his lot be here, it will be much harder hereafter. After a long and vexatious persecution, he will find that his sorrows are, in a manner, only beginning. After sin has dragged him through all the evils of this life, instead of releasing him in the next, it will, quote, bind him hand and foot and throw him into utter darkness, end quote. Since then the service of sin is, on all accounts, most grievous and every way intolerable, let us briefly inquire, before we conclude, whether virtue and religion make not fairer offers. And here we find, at first sight, everything reversed. 'Tis universally seen and confessed that virtue is the truest merit and the noblest distinction, that nothing in the world is or can be more amiable or more glorious. And if we choose to consider it in the lights of religion, it appears, at least, with equal lustre. To say there is no discredit, no dishonour in the practice of religion is to say nothing. That we are capable of serving God is the very dignity and pride of our nature. To serve Him is to serve the best and greatest of all beings, the origin of all glory and the fountain of all perfection. It is to serve Him who made us and protected us and poured an endless variety of blessings on us. It is to serve our ablest friend and kindest benefactor, the author of all grace, the giver of all good, and the ground of all our hopes. In a word, it is to serve Him who has every possible claim and title to our service, and will have forever. Again, the service of God is so far from bondage and slavery that it is perfect freedom. He is the greatest and most gracious of all masters, and His laws are as light and easy as could possibly consist with the welfare of His servants. They contain nothing grievous to the most ingenuous minds, as never departing from nature and reason, and always promoting the true interest of mankind. They debar us from nothing but doing harm to ourselves or fellow creatures, and permit us to range anywhere but in the paths of danger and destruction. Lastly, the service of God is infinitely secure and beneficial. Except in cases extraordinary, religion is at all times our best and surest protection. It is so far from exposing us to danger that one of its chief ends is to make and keep us safe both here and hereafter. Quote, He that walketh uprightly walketh surely, end quote, whatever chances or circumstances may befall him. From the evils of another life he is effectually and completely guarded, and generally from the evils of this. The wise rules he follows deliver him from innumerable misfortunes, and the favour of heaven, quote, defends him as it were with a shield, end quote. Nor does religion more tend to the prevention of all evil than to the production of all good. Great peace and comfort it always yields in this world, and oftentimes prosperity. But in the world to come it can never fail of producing the noblest fruits, and answering every expectation. There the faithful servants of God will most assuredly be crowned with exceeding happiness and eternal glory, be enriched with variety of blessings, greater and mightier than tongue can tell, or heart conceive. Upon the whole, since the service of sin is insupportable bondage, and the service of God perfect liberty and life everlasting, whatever choice we may make, most evident it is what we ought to make. And since by, committing sin, we surely and inevitably become, the servants of sin, how tender ought we to be of our innocence, and how tenacious of our integrity. If we have failed herein, it concerns us above all things to recover ourselves in time, and rectify what we find amiss, that being made free from sin, and becoming servants unto God, we may have our fruit unto holiness, and the end everlasting life.